I began this investigation not with bones, but with buildings, structures that felt wrong the moment you measured them. Corridors in state buildings with doorways exceeding 12 feet, not in ceremonial halls where one might expect grandeur, but in service passages where function should dictate form. Courthouses with benches so tall a seated person's feet dangle like a child's. Staircases with risers requiring an unnatural stretch to ascend. Architectural historians call it monumental style, a deliberate choice to inspire awe or convey power, a convenient explanation that ignores the fundamental problem of daily use. The anomaly became a pattern when I stopped measuring empty doorways and started examining who walked through them. In the photographic archives of St. Petersburg, I found the first image. A formal cabinet card from 1874 showing a man in military uniform standing beside what appears to be an ordinary soldier, except this man towered a full 3 feet above his companion. The proportions were so extreme I assumed manipulation until I examined 20 similar images from the same period. The shadows held, the grain matched, the perspective lines converged correctly. These were not fabrications. They were records of something our historical narrative cannot accommodate. The Russian imperial collections hold dozens more. Finnish archives contain similar portraits. American anthropological museums filed them away under medical curiosities and moved on. Always the same pattern. Document, dismiss, forget. But I kept asking the obvious question no one seemed willing to pursue. If these were merely isolated medical anomalies, why do they appear in such numbers, across such vast geography, during such a narrow window of time? And why, in image after image, do they stand before the very buildings whose impossible proportions I had been documenting? The pattern emerges most clearly in Siberia, though conventional histories would never lead you there. The region is presented as a vast emptiness, a frozen periphery, awaiting colonization by Russian explorers and fur traders. This narrative serves a purpose. It allows us to imagine Siberia as perpetually vacant, historically insignificant, its past reducible to scattered indigenous peoples and the Cossacks who claim to have conquered them. What it obscures is the possibility that something else existed there first, something whose physical remnants we have been misreading for centuries. Consider the Gornaya Shoria megaliths, discovered in southern Siberia in 2013 by geologists who were not searching for archaeological sites. They found massive stone blocks, stacked with apparent precision, granite walls formed of giant rectangles weighing 3,000 to 4,000 tons each. Mainstream geologists attribute these formations to natural weathering, jointed rock that fractured along geometric lines over millions of years. This explanation requires accepting that natural processes created walls with flat vertical faces, right-angle corners, and blocks stacked as if placed deliberately, then weathered in such a way that the stacked appearance intensified rather than eroded. The formations look like construction on a scale that dwarfs anything in the conventional historical record. Similar structures appear across the Siberian landscape. At Mount Vodavara in Karelia, researchers have documented what appear to be worked stone terraces and staircases cut directly into bedrock. Archaeologists classify these as sacred Sami sites, natural formations enhanced by later indigenous cultures. This interpretation avoids the question of who originally worked the stone and why the scale so consistently exceeds what human-sized builders would require. The mystery deepens when we examine what Russian imperial records actually document. When Yermak's Cossack forces crossed the Urals in the 1580s, they encountered not a single unified khanate, but a landscape dotted with abandoned structures of immense size. Fortifications too large for any defending force they faced. Empty buildings with doorways twice normal human height. Indigenous peoples reportedly told the Cossacks that these structures predated their own ancestors, that they were built by a people who had vanished before memory, leaving only stone and the stories of giants. In the 1720s, Daniel Gottlieb Messerschmitt, a German naturalist commissioned by Peter the Great to document Siberia's resources, recorded in his journals the discovery of multiple burials containing skeletons of unusual size. Near the Irtysh River, he described remains measuring over 8 feet from skull to heel. Local Tatars refused to approach the site, calling it the grave of ancient warriors who once ruled the region. Messerschmitt's findings were not isolated. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, as Russian exploration intensified, expedition after expedition reported similar discoveries. In 1804, miners near the Kolyma River uncovered a burial chamber containing skeletal remains so large that 2 men were required to lift the femur. In 1845, construction workers expanding the Trans-Siberian route near Krasnoyarsk unearthed graves arranged in a circular pattern, each containing remains exceeding 7.5 feet. The official reports follow a consistent pattern. Initial documentation acknowledges the unusual size, followed by reassurances that these represent statistical outliers within normal human variation, followed by the disappearance of the remains into museum storage, where they are subsequently lost or quietly discarded. One photograph from the Irkutsk Regional Archive shows a family group in 1887. The father stands at the center, easily 9 feet tall, his head approaching the upper border of the backdrop. His wife reaches his chest. His children cluster at his knees at normal heights. There is nothing suggesting deception. The clothing is period appropriate. The shadows fall consistently. The perspective matches. The only anomaly is his size, and that anomaly is unmistakable. If you have ever stood in a building constructed before 1850 and felt the proportions were somehow off, that the doorways seemed too large for comfortable use, you have already encountered this mystery without recognizing it. Consider leaving a comment about where you noticed it first. The photographs from Siberia lead to an unavoidable question that academic institutions have consistently refused to address. If these individuals were merely unusually tall humans, statistical outliers within normal variation, why do the records describe them not as curiosities, but as functioning members of society, holding positions of authority? The Irkutsk archives contain multiple references to persons of unusual stature, serving as guards at government facilities, as overseers on construction projects, as foremen in the very mines and railways being built across Siberia during the 19th century. These were not exhibits displayed for paying audiences. They were employees, neighbors, family members. The pattern repeats across the Russian Empire. In St. Petersburg, administrative buildings from the 1700s feature doorways reaching 12 feet in working corridors, where grandeur serves no purpose. The Winter Palace contains staircases with risers so tall that a normal person must stretch uncomfortably to ascend them. The Hermitage Museum preserves chairs and desks from the imperial period that stand several inches higher than standard furniture. Items cataloged as custom-made for particularly tall individuals, without ever questioning why so many such custom pieces survive from the same narrow historical window. Architectural historians explain these anomalies through the concept of monumental style, the theory that builders of the 18th and 19th centuries deliberately constructed oversized spaces to convey power, wealth, and imperial ambition. This explanation works for throne rooms and grand halls, where impression matters. It collapses when applied to service corridors, back staircases, and administrative offices, where no visitor would ever see them. It fails to explain why workers would build doorways they could barely reach, staircases they could not comfortably climb, furniture they could not practically use. The photographs provide the missing context. When you place a 9-foot human being in a 12-foot doorway, the proportions suddenly make sense. When you imagine a 7-foot clerk sitting at a desk, built several inches higher than standard, the furniture becomes functional rather than ornamental. The buildings were not designed to impress normal-sized people. They were designed to accommodate the people who actually used them. Russian imperial records from the 18th century contain passing references to these individuals, without the astonishment we might expect. In 1722, Peter the Great established a personal guard, composed entirely of men exceeding 7 feet in height, drawing recruits from the northern territories, where such stature appeared more frequently. Catherine the Great later maintained similar units, and contemporary accounts describe these guards not as anomalies, but as impressive specimens carefully selected for their proportions. The implication is that sufficiently tall individuals existed in sufficient numbers to staff such units across multiple generations. The Siberian connection becomes critical here. If these populations existed, If they held positions of authority and served in imperial institutions, where did they originate? And why does Siberia feature so prominently in the documentation? The indigenous traditions of the region provide a consistent answer. Khanty and Mansi oral histories describe an earlier people who inhabited the land before their own ancestors arrived. A race of builders and warriors of immense stature who constructed the stone structures scattered across the landscape. These accounts do not present these beings as gods or spirits, but as physical people who eventually vanished, leaving their forts and graves behind. Russian explorers recorded these traditions repeatedly, but categorized them as mythology, the kind of explanatory folklore that indigenous cultures create to account for ruins they cannot otherwise explain. This dismissal ignores the consistency of the accounts across widely separated linguistic and cultural groups. It ignores the physical evidence that explorers themselves documented and then allowed to disappear. It ignores the photographs that survive, despite institutional neglect. One image from the Tomsk Provincial Museum shows a man photographed in 1892 standing beside a standard wooden door. The door reaches his shoulder. His head clears the frame by several feet. The caption identifies him simply as a local merchant. No mention of his height is remarkable. No suggestion that he represents anything other than a normal member of his community. The ordinariness of the documentation is itself extraordinary. He was not photographed because he was a giant. He was photographed because he was a merchant, and the resulting image accidentally preserved evidence of something our historical narrative cannot accommodate. The buildings he would have entered, the government offices and commercial establishments of 19th century Siberia, survive in many cases to the present day. Their doorways match his proportions. Their counters reach a height that would have been comfortable for him. Their staircases accommodate his stride. We have been walking through these structures for generations, feeling vaguely that something about them seems off, accepting the explanations we were given, and never asking the obvious question. What if they were built the way they are, because the people who built them and the people who used them were not the same size as us? The question of origins becomes inescapable once you accept that the photographs document something real. If these individuals existed, if they lived and worked and held positions of authority across the Russian Empire during the 18th and 19th centuries, where did they come from, and why did they seemingly vanish from the historical record after 1900? The standard explanation, that they represent nothing more than unusually tall humans within normal variation, collapses under the weight of the evidence. Normal variation does not produce clusters of individuals exceeding 7.5 feet in multiple locations across multiple generations. Normal variation does not require the construction of entire buildings scaled to proportions that accommodate such stature. Something else was happening. The indigenous traditions of Siberia point consistently toward an earlier population that preceded the arrival of both Russian settlers and the Khanty and Mansi peoples themselves. These accounts describe a people who built in stone on a massive scale, who controlled territory across the region, and who eventually withdrew or disappeared under circumstances that the traditions do not clearly explain. Archaeologists have documented the physical remains of this population without recognizing them because the framework of conventional history provides no category for a pre-existing civilization of giant stature in Rus's, Northern Asia. Consider the Kurgan hypothesis, the mainstream archaeological theory that pastoral warriors from the Pontic Caspian steppe spread Indo-European languages and culture across Europe and Asia, beginning around 4,500 BCE. The Kurgans themselves, the burial mounds that give the theory its name, have been excavated across Siberia and Ukraine, revealing grave goods and skeletal remains that archaeologists measure and catalog, without noting the consistent pattern in the dimensions of the burial chambers. These chambers are frequently oversized, constructed with stone slabs, arranged to create interior spaces far larger than necessary for the remains they contain. The standard interpretation attributes this to ceremonial considerations, the desire to create impressive tombs for important individuals. But the chambers are not merely impressive. They are proportioned in ways that would accommodate occupants far taller than the skeletons found within them, suggesting either that the builders constructed tombs for people they expected to be larger, or that the skeletons have been misidentified. The same pattern appears in the megalithic structures scattered across the Ural Mountains and western Siberia. At several sites, researchers have documented what appear to be quarries, where massive stone blocks were extracted using techniques that remain unidentified. The blocks themselves show tool marks inconsistent with known indigenous methods, cuts so precise and clean that they suggest technologies beyond what conventional history assigns to the region's inhabitants. Geologists who encounter these sites routinely classify them as natural formations because the alternative would require rewriting the settlement history of northern Asia. The 19th century photographs provide a bridge between these ancient structures and the modern world. They show individuals whose proportions match the scale of the megalithic construction, individuals who could have worked the stone blocks at Gornaya Shoria, who could have climbed the staircases at Mount Vodovara, who could have passed through the oversized doorways of abandoned fortifications that greeted Yermak's Cossacks. The photographs suggest not a vanished prehistoric race, but a population that persisted into recent historical memory, interacting with normal-sized contemporaries, holding positions in imperial administration, and then somehow disappearing from view. The disappearance itself requires explanation. If these individuals existed in sufficient numbers to staff imperial guard units and work as construction foremen across Siberia, why do photographs of them cluster almost exclusively between 1,850 and 1,900? Why do the images become scarcer after 1900 and vanish entirely after 1920? One possibility emerges from the political transformations of the period. The late 19th century saw the rise of scientific racism and eugenic thinking across Europe and North America. Physical anomalies that had previously been accepted as variations within human diversity were increasingly pathologized, categorized as medical conditions requiring explanation or elimination. Individuals who deviated too far from statistical norms found themselves subjected to institutionalization, study, or worse. The Russian Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent Civil War created conditions in which entire populations could be erased from history, with little documentation. The photographs that survive from the imperial period show individuals who would have been adults in the 1880s and 1890s, people who would have been elderly by the time the Soviet state consolidated control. Their children and grandchildren, if they existed, would have grown up in a society increasingly hostile to visible difference, increasingly committed to a standardized vision of humanity that left no room for the variations the photographs document. The buildings remain. The doorways still stand 12 feet high in St. Petersburg administrative corridors. The staircases still rise with their impossibly tall risers in Buenos Aires municipal structures. The furniture still sits oversized in museums and estate sales, waiting for someone to ask why it was made that way. The photographs survive in archives, cataloged and ignored, showing us people who should not exist, according to our historical narrative, but who clearly did. The question is not whether they existed. The question is, what happened to them, and why we have been so carefully trained not to ask. The connection between these Siberian populations and the lost civilization referred to as Tartaria emerges not from a single document, but from the accumulation of details that conventional history cannot accommodate. Tartaria appears on world maps well into the 19th century, a vast territory spanning Siberia and Central Asia, labeled consistently across multiple cartographic sources, despite official histories claiming the region was sparsely inhabited by nomadic tribes. The maps show cities, rivers, mountain ranges, and administrative boundaries, details that cartographers did not invent, but compiled from existing sources now largely forgotten or suppressed. When you overlay the locations of oversized architectural anomalies onto these Tartarian maps, a pattern emerges. The Gornaya Shoria megaliths lie within territory, consistently labeled as Tartary. The Mount Vodovara terraces fall within the same region. The burial sites documented by Messerschmitt and later explorers cluster along the rivers and trade routes that Tartarian maps depict as connected by an extensive network of settlements. The photographs of unusually tall individuals originate from cities within this same territory. Cities like Irkutsk, Tomsk, and Krasnoyarsk that appear on Tartarian maps as established population centers long before Russian colonization. Mainstream historians explain these maps as errors, remnants of medieval geographical understanding that persisted through cartographic inertia long after explorers had supposedly proven the region empty. This explanation requires believing that mapmakers continued to label and detail a non-existent civilization for centuries, that they invented cities and boundaries and administrative divisions without any basis in fact, and that the Russian explorers who supposedly discovered these regions somehow failed to notice the ruins of the very cities their maps depicted. The explorers did notice. Their journals describe encountering stone foundations, collapsed structures, and extensive earthworks throughout Siberia, features they attributed to earlier inhabitants without ever identifying who those inhabitants were. In 1675, Nicholas Spafari, a Moldavian boyar, sent by Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich to establish diplomatic relations with China, traveled through Siberia and recorded his observations in detail. Near Yeniseisk, he described the remains of ancient fortifications built of stone blocks so large that 20 men could not move them. Local Tungus people told him the structures were there before their ancestors arrived, built by a people who had ruled the region in ancient times and then vanished. The Russian Orthodox Church played a significant role in suppressing this history. When old believers and other religious dissidents fled into Siberia during the 17th and 18th centuries to escape persecution, they encountered these ruins and incorporated them into their own narratives. Some describe Siberia as the location of Belavodie, the legendary land of justice and righteousness where true faith survived. Others identified the ruins as evidence of a pre-flood civilization destroyed by divine judgment for its sins. The Church responded by classifying such beliefs as heresy and destroying any written records that might substantiate them. The 19th century photographs add a dimension that maps and ruins cannot provide. They show individuals who could have been the builders, the rulers, the inhabitants of the civilization whose remnants dot the Siberian landscape. The clothing in these photographs is not ancient. It is the clothing of the 19th century, the same clothing worn by the normal-sized contemporaries standing beside them in studio portraits. These were not relics of a vanished age. They were living people, participating in the same society that produced the photographs, holding the same jobs, wearing the same fashions, reading the same newspapers. Their presence in 19th century Siberia suggests that the Tartarian civilization, if that is the correct term, did not vanish in some prehistoric catastrophe, but persisted into recent history, interacting with the expanding Russian Empire, gradually being absorbed, displaced, or eliminated as imperial control tightened. The buildings scaled to their proportions, the ones that seem oversized in strength. Petersburg and Buenos Aires and Delhi were not built for gods or for symbolic effect. They were built for people who needed them, people who walked through those 12-foot doorways every day, who climbed those oversized staircases, who sat at those high desks and wrote letters and conducted business and lived ordinary lives, except for the one detail we have been trained to ignore. The pattern of suppression becomes clear when you examine what happened to the physical evidence. The skeletons excavated in the 18th and 19th centuries did not end up in museums for public display. They were shipped to institutional collections in Moscow and St. Petersburg, catalogued briefly and then lost or destroyed. The photographs were filed away in regional archives, where researchers could access them only with difficulty. The buildings were explained away through architectural theory. The maps were dismissed as errors. Each piece of evidence was isolated, neutralized, rendered harmless through the simple expedient of never connecting it to the others. But the connections exist whether we acknowledge them or not. The photographs connect to the buildings connect to the maps connect to the ruins connect to the oral traditions. And all of it connects to Siberia, that vast territory we have been taught to think of as empty, which may instead be the last refuge of something our history books could not contain. The evidence accumulates toward a conclusion that unsettles everything we think we know about the past. Photographs of people who should not exist. Buildings scaled to proportions that make no sense for their supposed occupants. Maps depicting a civilization erased from standard histories. Oral traditions describing giant builders who preceded every known culture in Siberia. Each piece stands alone, easily dismissed, easily explained away through the frameworks we have been given. But together, they form a pattern that demands something more than the casual dismissals offered by institutional authorities. The disappearance of these populations from the historical record after 1900 mirrors the disappearance of Tartaria from world maps during the same period. Both vanish not through conquest or catastrophe, but through redefinition, through the quiet work of cartographers and historians and museum curators who decided that certain things no longer fit the narrative and must therefore be removed. The photographs were filed away. The skeletons were lost. The maps were revised. The buildings were given new explanations. The people were forgotten. What remains are questions that no amount of revision can fully suppress. Why do the photographs cluster so heavily between 1850 and 1900, the very decades when photography became widely available and when the Russian Empire was intensifying its control over Siberia? Why do the buildings from this period and earlier feature proportions that match these individuals so precisely? Why do the oral traditions of indigenous Siberian peoples consistently describe a pre-existing race of giant builders? A description that matches neither known historical populations nor the mythological beings common to other cultures. The standard academic response to such questions is to invoke the concept of paradigm protection, the tendency of established institutions to resist evidence that would require fundamental revision of their core assumptions. This resistance is not necessarily malicious. It is simply how knowledge systems maintain stability. Anomalies are filed away, explained through existing frameworks, or ignored until they accumulate to the point where the framework must shift. The question is whether we have reached that point. Whether the photographs and the buildings and the maps and the traditions together constitute enough accumulated anomaly to justify asking what really happened in Siberia before the Russians arrived. The images from Irkutsk and Tomsk show us faces that deserve more than archival obscurity. They show men and women who lived, who posed for photographers in their best clothing, who stood beside family members of ordinary height and looked directly into the lens with the same expressions we see in any 19th century portrait. They were not exhibits or anomalies in their own estimation. They were simply people, living their lives, unaware that future generations would be taught that they could not have existed. The buildings that survive in St. Petersburg and Buenos Aires and Delhi stand as silent witnesses, their oversized doorways and staircases still waiting for the people who once walked through them. The megaliths at Gornaya Shoria remain on their mountain, unexplained by natural processes, unacknowledged by mainstream archaeology. The maps showing Tartaria gather dust in archives, their boundaries and cities still legible, still corresponding to locations where anomalous structures and photographs originate. We are left with a choice. We can continue accepting the explanations we were given, the assurances that these are merely curiosities, coincidences, misinterpretations. We can file the photographs away again, walk through the buildings without measuring their doorways, read the explorer accounts as folklore rather than testimony. Or we can ask the question that the evidence demands. What if the history we have been taught is incomplete? What if Siberia was not an empty wilderness awaiting colonization, but the homeland of a people whose existence we have been trained to forget? What if the photographs are not curiosities but evidence, the last remaining traces of something our narrative could not accommodate, preserved by accident because no one thought to destroy them? The buildings still stand, the photographs still exist, the questions remain unanswered. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.